The fluorescent lights of the Eastbrook Mall food court hummed with a sterile, insistent energy. It was a symphony of modern commerce. The clatter of plastic trays, the sharp sizzle of a griddle, the low, murmuring roar of 100 conversations. In this hive of transient humanity, a woman named Lena sat alone at a corner table, a half-eaten salad bowl before her. She was a ghost in a machine, a master of anonymity in a world that demanded constant visibility. Her phone, a lifeline to the curated solitude of her digital world, was clutched in her hand. For Lena, every public space was a minefield, a place where the unwary could be seen, judged, or, worst of all, interacted with. Her personal space wasn't just a physical bubble. It was a psychological fortress built with the bricks of past traumas and the mortar of intense social anxiety. She saw the world not as a collection of people, but as a series of potential invasions. The unexpected knock on her door, the unsolicited glance on the subway, the friendly cashier who asked too many questions. These were all small cracks in her wall, moments that threatened to let the chaos of the world seep in. Her greatest fear was not of being hurt, but of being seen, of having her carefully constructed non-existence shattered by a world that refused to leave her alone. Then the world shattered, not with a bang, but with a sudden, overwhelming explosion of sound and light. It began with a ripple in the crowd, a collective intake of breath that was not a gasp of surprise, but a murmur of recognition. A ripple that quickly became a wave, and then a torrent. A young man, his face a caricature of internet fame, his smile a blinding white against the dark gray of his hoodie, was striding through the food court. Jimmy, the global phenomenon known as MrBeast, was here, and in his wake came a phalanx of cameras, microphones, and a small army of grinning assistants, their faces alight with the infectious energy of a planned spectacle. They moved with the terrifying efficiency of a special operations team, cutting a path through the stunned crowd, their lenses focused, their mission clear. They were not just people. They were a collective lens, a single, unblinking eye that saw everything and consumed it for an audience of millions. They were the physical manifestation of Lena's greatest fear. The 20-second psychological hook began the moment their collective gaze landed on her. For a split second, an eternity frozen in the quantum physics of a panic attack, Lena's world collapsed. Time, an endless river of moments, became a single, sharp shard of glass. The roar of the food court faded into a distant echo, replaced by the deafening sound of her own heartbeat, a frantic, primordial drumbeat in her ears. The lens of the camera was no longer a piece of technology. It was a hungry, predatory eye. It was the eye of her abuser, the eye of the world, the eye of God itself, all focused on her, dissecting her, consuming her very essence. The world went from a muted, manageable space to a violent, kaleidoscopic blur. The crowd, a faceless mob, just moments ago, was now a sea of pointing fingers and whispered words. She could feel their eyes on her, 1,000 tiny pinpricks of light that felt like burning coals on her skin. The camera, a sleek, black object of her terror, was pointed directly at her face, its lens a gaping, mechanical mouth. The man behind it, a young, eager assistant with a headset, was a harbinger of a nightmare she had fought to escape. He wasn't just filming her, he was stealing her anonymity, her peace, her very right to exist unbothered. The psychological hook wasn't about the money or the celebrity or the surprise. It was about the loss of control, the invasion of a carefully constructed psychological barrier that had been her only defense against a cruel world. The cameras were not just an inconvenience. They were a violation. In that frozen moment, Lena's mind didn't process the words MrBeast or $10,000. It processed only one thing: intrusion. The memory of a past trauma, a controlling ex-partner who had used a camera to monitor and manipulate her every move, surfaced with a sickening clarity. He hadn't been a celebrity. He had been a monster. He had used a camera to document her life, to capture her most vulnerable moments, to shame and control her. Every time he had pointed the lens at her, it had felt like a physical assault, a violation of her person. The camera had been his weapon, and now, here in the food court, 100 more weapons were aimed at her. The world, it seemed, was a never-ending cycle of the same old violence, just with a new face. The man in the hoodie, MrBeast himself, approached her table. His smile, the one that had captivated millions, was, to Lena, a mask of a grinning villain, a harbinger of the end of her world. He held a giant, novelty check in his hands, a ridiculously oversized object that felt like a mockery. He spoke, his voice booming and cheerful, a jarring, alien sound in the silent, terrifying space of her mind. Congratulations! You just won $10,000. Just for being here. We're giving away money to random people in the mall. The words were gibberish. Lena's brain, her survival instincts kicking in, was processing on a different level. It was not hearing money or congratulations. It was hearing, I'm filming you. I'm exposing you. I own you. The check, the money, the cameras, it was all one big, horrifying package deal. A deal she hadn't signed up for. A deal that was being forced upon her. She had built her entire life around one simple, unshakable rule. Do not be seen. And now, a man with a team of cameras was not only seeing her, he was presenting her to the world. He was making her the spectacle. The feeling was a nauseating blend of a physical and emotional assault, a violation of her very being. Her hand, a thing of its own will, moved. Not to take the check, not to shake his hand, not to thank him. It moved to protect herself, to shield her face from the hungry, predatory eyes of the cameras. It was a primal, desperate, nonverbal plea. Don't film me. Please don't film me. The words, however, were lost in the roar of the food court, in the cheerful, relentless energy of MrBeast's team. Her hands, her only weapons, moved to strike the source of the terror, the source of the intrusion. It was a desperate, panicked lashing out against the lens, a physical manifestation of a psychological scream. The slap, a sharp, clean sound that cut through the humming air, was not an act of violence against a person. It was an act of self-preservation, a primal, frantic attempt to defend her last bastion of peace from a world that had, once again, come to take it away. It was a slap at the camera, a slap at the fame, a slap at the very concept of being seen. The world stopped. The humming of the lights, the clatter of the trays, the low roar of the crowd. It all vanished, replaced by a sudden, deafening silence. MrBeast's face, for a split second, was not a caricature of internet fame. It was a young man, shocked, confused, and hurt. The camera operators froze, their lenses still pointed, but their hands no longer steady. The assistants, their grins replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, were statues. The crowd, the faceless mob, was no longer a sea of murmuring voices, but a single, collective gasp of utter shock. A woman had just slapped MrBeast. A woman had just slapped the internets. The silence lasted for only a moment, but it was an eternity. A moment of pure, unadulterated chaos, frozen in time. Then the world exploded again, not with a hum, but with a roar. A roar of outrage, of condemnation, of judgment. She slapped him, someone in the crowd yelled, a voice of furious disbelief. Did you see that? She slapped MrBeast. Phones were immediately raised, not to capture a moment of joy, but to capture a moment of viral infamy. Lena's face, the face she had fought so hard to hide, was now the center of a million digital eyes. The very thing she had tried to prevent, the very thing she had lashed out against, had now become an undeniable, inescapable reality. Lena, her breath catching in her throat, her heart a frantic, panicked drum, could only stare. The slap, her desperate primal act of self-preservation, had been a catastrophic failure. She had not stopped the cameras. She had not regained control. She had, in fact, made it all 1,000 times worse. She was no longer a ghost in the machine. She was the central, terrifying spectacle. Her face, her image, her act of defiance would now be beamed to a world of millions, a world that would tear her apart, dissect her, and judge her without mercy. She had tried to escape the lens, and in doing so, she had become the very thing she feared most, a viral moment. The psychological fortress she had built over a lifetime had not just been breached. It had been utterly, completely, and irrevocably demolished. The world, her world, was gone. It had been replaced by a new one, a violent, overwhelming, and terrifying place where she was no longer an observer, but a spectacle. The 20-second hook was over. The story was just beginning. It was not a story of a woman and a generous gift. It was a story of a woman and a slap, and a story of a world that, in its relentless pursuit of content, had finally found a new kind of villain to feast upon. The sound of the slap, a sharp, concussive crack, echoed far beyond the sterile confines of the Eastbrook Mall food court. It was a soundbite, a micro-moment of chaos that went viral with a speed that was both terrifying and inevitable. Within minutes, the video, a low-quality, shaky recording from a bystander's phone, was everywhere. Woman slaps MrBeast for $10,000. The headline screamed, a caption of fury and disbelief. The internet, a faceless, furious mob, was in a frenzy. The slap, a primal act of self-preservation, was universally interpreted as an act of outrageous entitlement, of ungrateful cruelty, of a shocking, inexplicable rejection of a simple act of kindness. The digital world was in an uproar, and Lena's face, her expression a mix of terror and defiance, was now the face of a new kind of villainy. Lena, however, was not in a digital world. She was in a physical one, a world that was now a suffocating prison. The slap, a desperate attempt to regain control, had done the opposite. It had plunged her into a psychological maelstrom of regret, shame, and a crushing sense of fatalistic doom. She had fled the food court in a daze, her mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated panic. She didn't remember leaving, or walking to her car, or driving home. She just remembered the faces of the people, their eyes filled with a furious judgment, and the unblinking, relentless gaze of the cameras. The lens, her deepest fear, had not been defeated. It had won. She retreated to her apartment, a small, meticulously organized fortress of solitude. The apartment, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. She locked the door, pulled the curtains, and turned off her phone. She was trying to become a ghost again, a ghost that the world had already seen, already judged, already condemned. The slap, the moment of pure, raw panic, was an act of such profound vulnerability that it had broken her. She had been exposed, not just to the internet, but to herself. She had shown the world her deepest, darkest secret, her terror of being seen. And the world, as she had always suspected, had not been kind. The internet, however, was not so easily shut out. Her face was everywhere. Memes were created, using her terrified, defiant expression as a template for 1,000 different jokes. Hashtags trended, calling for her to be canceled, for her to be found, for her to be punished. Her small, carefully curated online presence, a ghost of an Instagram account with a handful of followers and no photos, was quickly discovered. The comments, a tidal wave of hatred, were relentless. They were not just insults. They were personal attacks, character assassinations, and threats of violence. They were, in a way, a physical assault, a digital version of the slaps she had just dealt to the world. The world was now slapping her back, 1,000 times over, with a cruelty that was both faceless and relentless. But there was a twist, a subtle, almost invisible thread that MrBeast and his team, in the midst of their own confusion and shock, began to pull on. They were reviewing the footage, trying to understand what had gone wrong. They had prepared for every contingency. A shy person, an overwhelmed person, a person who would cry with joy. They had not prepared for this. As Jimmy and his video editor, Carl, replayed the footage in slow motion, they noticed something strange. Lena's eyes. For a fraction of a second, a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance, her eyes were not on Jimmy or the check or the cameras. Her eyes were fixed on someone in the background, a man in a dark trench coat, standing in the shadows of a corner booth, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't a part of the spectacle. He was just a ghost in the background. But for Lena, that ghost was everything. Her moment of terror, her frantic, desperate slap, was a reaction to him, not to Jimmy. The psychological hook, the central, defining moment of the video was not the slap. It was the glance. A 20-second moment, the brief window of time between the cameras focusing on her and the slap itself, was a moment of pure, unadulterated panic. It was a moment where Lena's mind, her psyche, had been completely hijacked by a trauma from her past. The man in the trench coat, a silent, menacing figure in the background, was not just a coincidence. He was the catalyst. He was the reason for the slap. The slap was not an act of ungrateful cruelty. It was an act of pure, desperate, primal terror. It was a warning, a desperate cry for help, a frantic attempt to break free from a nightmare that had come back to haunt her. Jimmy, a man who had built an empire on spectacle, felt a strange, unsettling feeling of unease. This was not the story he wanted to tell. This was not the content he wanted to create. He was not a villain, a man who had intentionally caused a woman to react with such a profound, visceral fear. He was a content creator, yes, but he was also a human being. The look in Lena's eyes, a look of a cornered animal, haunted him. It was a look that transcended the simple, one-dimensional narrative of a viral video. It was a look of a person in pain. And for the first time in his career, Jimmy felt a profound sense of responsibility for a story he had not meant to write. He made a decision. Against the advice of his entire team, who saw this as a PR nightmare, he decided to find her. He decided to find the woman who had slapped him. He decided to find the truth behind the story. He wasn't going to make a video about it. He was going to make it his personal mission. He had to understand. He had to know. The slap, a moment of public humiliation, was now for him a mystery, a puzzle, a challenge. He was no longer just MrBeast, the content king. He was Jimmy, the man who had been slapped and who now felt a deep, profound sense of empathy for the woman who had slapped him. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was now for him the beginning of a different kind of story. A story of redemption, of understanding, of a quest for a truth that was more important than any viral moment. But the internet, in its fury, was not going to wait for the truth. It was already writing its own narrative. Lena's face, her home, her family, her friends were all being exposed. The digital inquisition was in full swing, and Lena, a ghost who had suddenly become a public figure, was at the center of the storm. She was a woman who had, with a single, desperate slap, become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. And she was all alone, or so she thought. The digital footprints, a series of breadcrumbs she had left for herself, were now being followed, not by a stalker, but by a man who was looking for the truth. Jimmy and his team, using their considerable resources, were able to find Lena's apartment, not with a mob of cameras, but with a single, discreet phone call. A call to the property manager, a quiet conversation, and a promise to make a donation to the apartment building's youth fund. The manager, a man who had grown tired of the intrusive media, was a willing accomplice. He gave them the key, a quiet, almost conspiratorial gesture of solidarity. Jimmy arrived at her apartment, not with a crew, but with just his manager, Carl. They were two men, two human beings, standing before a locked door, a door that was a symbol of a shattered psychological fortress. They knocked, a soft, polite sound that was a stark contrast to the deafening roar of the internet. They knocked again. No answer. They tried the key, and the door opened, a small, quiet, almost apologetic sound. They entered, and they found a woman, Lena, huddled in a corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. She was a prisoner in her own home, a victim of a viral moment that she had not chosen, a victim of a story that she had not written. The story was about to change. It was about to twist again, not with a slap, but with a quiet, compassionate, and profound act of human connection. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was about to become the catalyst for a different kind of ending. An ending of redemption, of understanding, of a new beginning for a woman who had, for a single, terrifying moment, become the most hated person on the internet. The knock on the door was not a celebrity's theatrical gesture. It was a quiet, almost apologetic sound. It was the sound of two men, not a camera crew, standing on the other side. But for Lena, who was huddled in the dark like a cornered animal, it was the sound of the world, of the mob, of the cameras, finally finding her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm that was the only sound in the suffocating silence of her apartment. She didn't know how they had found her. She didn't know how they had breached her fortress. She only knew that the end had come. The slap, her desperate act of defiance, had not saved her. It had only delayed her inevitable capture. When Jimmy and Carl entered, Lena didn't see two human beings. She saw two shadows, two figures silhouetted against the bright, cruel light of the outside world. They were not men. They were the collective manifestation of her deepest fears. They were the world, and they had come for her. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just curled into herself, a small, fragile ball of fear and shame. She was a ghost, a spirit that had been disturbed, a phantom that had been caught in the harsh glare of a camera lens. Jimmy, however, didn't see a villain. He didn't see a viral moment. He saw a person in profound, unadulterated pain. The footage, a raw, unfiltered record of the moment of the slap, had been a puzzle. The person huddled in the corner, a fragile, terrified woman, was the answer. He and Carl didn't approach her with cameras or microphones. They approached her with a quiet, respectful distance. They sat on the floor, a few feet away, their bodies a signal of their non-threatening intent. "Lena," Jimmy said, his voice low and calm, a jarring contrast to the booming, cheerful persona he used for his videos. "We're not here to film you. We're not here to make a video. We're here to talk." Lena, a ghost in her own home, flinched. The sound of her name, the sound of a human voice, was a shock to her system. She hadn't heard a human voice in days. The only sounds had been the frantic drumbeat of her own heart and the distant, imagined roar of the internet. "Don't," she whispered, her voice a raw, painful rasp. "Don't film me. Please, don't. We're not filming you," Carl said, his voice equally calm and reassuring. He held up his hands, a gesture of peace. "The cameras are off. The phones are in our pockets. We just want to know what happened." Lena, a woman who had built her entire life around one simple, unshakable rule, was confronted with a new, terrifying reality. The world, it seemed, was not always a cruel, faceless mob. Sometimes it was two men sitting on the floor, their voices calm, their bodies non-threatening. She slowly, painfully uncurled herself, her eyes, red and swollen from days of crying, fixed on them. She didn't see the grinning celebrity now. She saw two human beings, their faces etched with a profound, compassionate concern. The psychological hook, the 20-second moment of terror, was now, for the first time, being re-examined. Lena, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage, began to tell her story. It wasn't a story of a slap. It was a story of a stalker, a controlling ex-partner who had used a camera to document and manipulate her every move. He had been a monster, a man who had used the very tool that Jimmy had built his empire on, to destroy her. The camera, for Lena, was not a tool of creation. It was a weapon of destruction. He called it his memory bank. She whispered the words a painful, guttural confession. He would film me, in my sleep, in my most vulnerable moments. He would show the videos to me, not as a memory, but as a weapon, a reminder of his control, a reminder that I was his. The camera, it was his eye, it was his leash. Jimmy and Carl listened, their faces a mix of horror and empathy. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was now, for them, a moment of profound, terrible clarity. It wasn't about them. It wasn't about the money. It was about her. It was about a woman who, upon seeing a man who had once stalked her, a man in a dark trench coat, a man who had been a ghost in her past, had reacted with a primal, desperate act of self-preservation. She had slapped the camera, not the man. She had slapped the symbol of her trauma. And in doing so, she had become a symbol of a new, terrifying reality. A reality where the line between content and cruelty had become blurred, where a single, unthinking act of fame-making could trigger a lifetime of trauma. The real villain wasn't Lena. It was the man in the trench coat. It was the stalker, the man who had, for a fleeting moment, been captured on camera, a ghost in the background, a silent, menacing figure in the shadows. He had come back to haunt her, and Jimmy and his team, in their relentless pursuit of content, had inadvertently brought them face to face. The psychological hook was not just about Lena's panic. It was about the stalker's manipulation. The stalker, a man named Marcus, had been following her for years. He had seen the MrBeast video, and he had seen his chance. He had been a ghost in the background, a silent spectator to her panic. He had been using the internet, the very tool that Jimmy had mastered, as his own personal weapon. The comments, the threats, the hate mail, he had been a part of it all. He had been using the mob, the faceless digital legion, as his own personal army. The slap, a moment of public humiliation, was not just a viral video. It was a new, terrifying chapter in a story of a stalker and his victim. Jimmy, a man who had built an empire on spectacle, was now faced with a moral crisis. He had inadvertently put a woman in harm's way. He had not just made a video. He had participated in a larger, more sinister story. He was not a villain, but he had, through his own naivete and ambition, become an accomplice. The fame he had so carefully curated, the platform he had so meticulously built, was now a weapon in the hands of a monster. He had to act. He had to use his platform, not for content, but for justice. He and Carl spent the rest of the night in Lena's apartment, not as producers, but as protectors. They ordered food, they talked, and they listened. They listened to Lena's story, a story of a woman who had, through a single, terrifying act, become a hero in her own right. She had not been ungrateful. She had not been cruel. She had been a survivor who had, with a single desperate slap, tried to save herself from a monster who had been haunting her for years. The next morning, Jimmy and Carl left Lena's apartment, not with a camera crew, but with a new plan. A plan that would use the very thing that had shattered her life, the internet, to save her. The viral video, a monument to cruelty and ungratefulness, was about to become something else entirely. It was about to become a monument to courage, to resilience, and to a new kind of heroism. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was about to become the catalyst for a different kind of story. An ending of redemption, of understanding, of a new beginning for a woman who had, for a single, terrifying moment, become the most hated person on the internet. The global viral sensation of the MrBeast slap video had reached a fever pitch. Lena's face, now a symbol of entitlement and cruelty, was a digital icon of scorn. The narrative was simple and merciless. An ungrateful woman, presented with a life-changing sum of money, had reacted with violence, biting the hand that fed her. The internet, a mob with a collective memory of a goldfish, was already moving on to the next story, but the damage to Lena was permanent. She was a public pariah, a ghost who had been forcibly dragged into the harsh, unblinking light of the world, only to be torn apart by it. The psychological trauma of the event, the feeling of being a spectacle, of being judged and condemned by millions, was a far more profound pain than any slap could ever inflict. She was a prisoner in her own home, a gilded cage built not of bars, but of a digital reputation that she could never escape. But a new narrative was beginning to take shape, not on a viral video, but in the quiet, compassionate minds of two men who had seen the truth. Jimmy and Carl, armed with the knowledge of Lena's story, were now on a mission. Their goal was not to create content, but to right a wrong. The viral video, the very thing that had caused all this pain, was about to be used as a weapon, not against Lena, but for her. The cameras, once a symbol of her terror, were about to become the tools of her salvation. Their first step was to identify the man in the trench coat, the ghost in the background of the food court video. They used their considerable resources, their network of private investigators and digital forensic experts, to track down the man. They cross-referenced his face, a grainy, low-quality image from the bystander's video, with every public record, every social media profile, every surveillance camera in the city. The search was a difficult one, a needle-in-a-haystack endeavor, but they were not going to give up. They had seen the terror in Lena's eyes, and they knew they had to find him. The psychological hook, the 20-second moment of panic, was now the key to the entire mystery. The man in the trench coat, a man named Marcus, had been Lena's ex-partner, a controlling, manipulative stalker who had used a camera to document and control her every move. He had been a predator, and Lena had been his prey. The food court, the place where she had tried to find a moment of peace, had become a hunting ground. The cameras, Jimmy's cameras, had inadvertently been a part of the hunt. They had, through their relentless pursuit of content, cornered Lena, a woman who was already running for her life. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was now a moment of profound, terrible clarity. It was a scream, a primal, desperate act of self-preservation, a frantic attempt to break free from a monster who had been haunting her for years. The investigation led them to a startling, terrifying discovery. Marcus, the man in the trench coat, was not just a stalker. He was a professional digital blackmailer, a man who had used a network of fake social media accounts, of fake IP addresses, of fake personas to torment his victims. He had used the internet, the very tool that Jimmy had mastered, as his own personal weapon. He had been a ghost in the machine, a silent, menacing figure in the shadows of the digital world. He had used the internet to destroy people's lives, to ruin their reputations, to make them prisoners in their own homes. He was a new kind of villain, a digital predator, a man who had used the very concept of visibility, the very concept of fame, as his weapon. Jimmy and Carl, armed with this information, decided to confront him, not with a camera crew, but with a new plan, a plan that would use the internet, the very tool that had been a weapon in the hands of a monster, as a force for good. The confrontation was not going to be a viral video. It was going to be a live stream, a live broadcast to millions, a live unmasking of a digital predator. They were going to use their platform, not for content, but for justice. The location for the confrontation was a small, quiet, discreet coffee shop in a different part of the city, a place where they could meet Marcus without a camera crew, without a mob, without a spectacle. They had arranged the meeting under the pretense of a business deal, a potential collaboration between Marcus, a man who had been a ghost in the shadows, and MrBeast, the king of the spectacle. Marcus, a man who had been a predator in the shadows, was now being lured into the harsh, unblinking light of the world. He was walking into a trap built not of bars but of a live stream, a live broadcast to millions. Marcus, a man who had been a master of manipulation, was now being manipulated. His face, his expressions, his body language were all being broadcast to millions, a live unmasking of a digital predator. The questions were like a series of punches, a relentless, non-violent assault on his psyche. He was being cornered, not in a food court, but in a coffee shop. He was being exposed, not by a single desperate slap, but by a relentless, unblinking live stream. He was a ghost in the shadows, and he was being dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of the world. The confrontation culminated in a moment of pure, unadulterated drama. Jimmy, with a look of profound, compassionate resolve on his face, looked directly into the camera, a camera that was hidden in a pen, a camera that was broadcasting to millions. "Lena, if you're watching this," he said, his voice a low, calm, reassuring sound. "If you're watching this, I want you to know that you are not alone. You are not a villain. You are a hero, and we're going to get justice for you." The unmasking was complete. The villain, the digital predator, the man in the trench coat, was now exposed. His face, his name, his crimes, it was all being broadcast to millions. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was now a moment of profound, terrible clarity. It was a cry for help. It was a scream. It was a warning. It was the beginning of the end for a man who had used the internet as his weapon, and the beginning of a new chapter for a woman who had, with a single desperate act, become a hero. The story was about to come to an end, but the end was not an end. It was a beginning of a new kind of heroism, a new kind of storytelling, a new kind of justice. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was about to become a monument to courage, to resilience, and to a new kind of heroism. The fun, the excitement, the twists and turns had just begun. And a new, unexpected chapter for a woman who had found her purpose in the most unexpected of places was about to begin. The live stream of the unmasking went viral with a speed that was both unprecedented and inspiring. The video, the real story behind the MrBeast slap, was not a monument to cruelty and ungratefulness. It was a monument to courage, to resilience, and to a new kind of heroism. Lena's face, once an icon of scorn, was now an icon of strength. The slap, once a symbol of entitlement, was now a symbol of a desperate act of self-preservation. The internet, a faceless, furious mob, just days ago, was now a collective force for good, a legion of digital detectives, a mob of compassionate defenders. The story had not ended in a tragedy. It had ended in a triumph. The villain, Marcus, the man in the trench coat, was arrested, a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to a terrifying saga. He was not a celebrity. He was a criminal. The digital empire he had built on a foundation of blackmail and cruelty was dismantled. His network of fake social media accounts, of fake IP addresses, of fake personas, was exposed. He was a ghost in the machine, and the machine had finally caught him. The story had not just ended in a triumph. It had ended in a profound, terrible clarity. The line between content and cruelty had been blurred, and now, for the first time, it was clear. The internet, a tool of creation, could also be a weapon of destruction. And it was up to us, all of us, to choose which one it would be. Lena, a ghost who had been forcibly dragged into the harsh, unblinking light of the world, was now, for the first time, a human being. The psychological fortress she had built over a lifetime had not been demolished. It had been rebuilt, not of bricks of trauma and mortar of social anxiety, but of bricks of resilience and mortar of courage. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was now, for her, a moment of profound, terrible clarity. It was a moment of liberation. She had not been a victim. She had been a survivor. She had not been ungrateful. She had been a hero. She had not been a ghost. She had been a human being. The inspiration, the final twist, was not a slap, but a conversation. A quiet, compassionate, and profound conversation between two human beings, two people from opposite ends of the spectrum of visibility. Lena, a woman who had, for a single, terrifying moment, become the most hated person on the internet, and Jimmy, a man who had, for a single, powerful act, become the most loved. The conversation was not about the money. It was about the future. It was about a new kind of heroism. The $10,000, which had been the catalyst for a viral moment, was now a symbol of a new beginning. Lena, a woman who had been a victim, was now a hero. She decided to use the money, not for herself, but for others. She created a nonprofit organization, the Gilded Cage, a sanctuary for victims of digital stalking and harassment, a place where they could find a new kind of fortress, a new kind of home. The organization was not just a place of refuge. It was a place of empowerment, a place where victims could find a new kind of voice, a new kind of courage, a new kind of heroism. The story had begun with a slap, a moment of viral infamy. It had ended with a legacy, a testament to a woman who had, with a single desperate act, become a hero. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was now a moment of profound, terrible clarity. It was a reminder that we are all, in our own way, a ghost in the machine. We are all, in our own way, a victim of a world that demands constant visibility. But we are also, in our own way, a hero. We are all, in our own way, a survivor. The final message of the story was not a moral lesson. It was an inspiration to be kind, to be compassionate, to be a hero, not in a viral video, but in a quiet, compassionate act. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was now a moment of profound, terrible clarity. It was a reminder that the greatest stories are not the ones we write. They are the ones we live. The fun, the excitement, the twists and turns had just begun. In a new, unexpected chapter for a woman who had found her purpose in the ghost of a legend was about to begin.